She said her daughter needed a view from the window, but she didn't know what her stubbornness would lead to. The plane couldn't take off anymore, and everything changed before the passengers' eyes. Look what her refusal led to. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Michael Johnson had been staring at the calendar for months, waiting for the day when he and his wife could finally take the trip they had been dreaming about. Life had not been easy for either of them. Michael, at 34, carried the weight of responsibility that came with running his own company, Nova Systems, a business that had grown rapidly in the last decade and consumed nearly every waking hour of his time. His wife, Amanda, a medical researcher of 32, was equally exhausted from long days and nights in laboratories, fighting deadlines and chasing funding. Both of them had sacrificed weekends, evenings, and much of their private life in the name of progress and ambition. Yet now, for the first time in years, they had carved out 2 weeks just for themselves, a much-deserved vacation far from obligations and stress. The atmosphere at the Atlanta International Terminal that morning was everything one would expect. Restless travelers dragging suitcases, families trying to corral children, security lines that felt endless, and the constant stream of announcements echoing through the cavernous hall. The smell of burnt coffee and fried breakfast sandwiches lingered in the air. Michael and Amanda, however, felt buoyant, even amidst the chaos. Their tickets for first class, tucked safely inside Michael's leather wallet, symbolized a personal victory. They had worked for years to get to this point. This wasn't about luxury so much as it was about recognition that they had earned the right to comfort. Amanda squeezed his hand as they walked together toward their gate, the weight of anticipation pressing pleasantly on both of them. As boarding was announced, they joined the smaller line for priority seating, their shoulders straightening ever so slightly with pride. They were not accustomed to being in that section. It felt strange, even exhilarating, to walk down the jet bridge among business travelers in tailored suits and seasoned flyers who moved with the quiet assurance of people who belong there. For Michael and Amanda, it was new territory, a space they had once watched from a distance, with a mixture of curiosity and yearning. When they stepped inside the first-class cabin, the difference was striking. Plush, spacious seats lined each side of the aisle, each one wide enough to swallow a person whole compared to the narrow rows of economy. There was a hushed air about the cabin, as though the rules of the airport's chaos stopped at the curtain that divided classes. Passengers were already settling in with newspapers, tablets, and glasses of orange juice offered on trays. The couple exchanged a look of shared satisfaction, their smiles soft but proud. That moment of peace lasted until they reached their assigned seats. Michael paused, double-checked the numbers printed neatly on the tickets, then looked again at the seats before them. 2 people were already there. A white woman in her mid-40s with neatly styled blonde hair sat in the aisle seat, while a young girl of about 12 occupied the window seat. The girl had headphones draped around her neck and was already pressing her face eagerly to the glass, as though claiming it as her territory. The woman, whom they would soon know as Caroline Hughes, had her handbag tucked neatly at her side and gave no sign of preparing to move. Michael cleared his throat politely and looked again at the seat numbers, certain there must be some mistake. But there was none. These were his and Amanda's seats. Amanda glanced at him with quiet confusion, waiting for him to take the lead. Caroline looked up, her expression calm, almost dismissive, and explained that her daughter Emily preferred to sit by the window and that she had simply taken the pair of seats together so they could enjoy the flight in peace. Her tone carried the certainty of someone who expected the explanation to be enough. The implication was clear. The inconvenience belonged to someone else, not to her and her child. Michael's hand tightened slightly around the tickets. Amanda shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between the seated passengers and her husband. It was such a small thing on the surface, a child wanting a window seat, but the quiet presumption that they should simply accept the displacement was unmistakable. The surrounding passengers began to notice, heads lifting from newspapers, glances exchanged over armrests. Some faces showed curiosity, others mild irritation at the potential disruption of their smooth boarding process. A flight attendant appeared, all smiles and polished calm, as though trained to dissolve conflicts with a soothing voice. She listened briefly as Michael explained that these were their assigned seats, then turned to Carolyn, who repeated her justification with an air of confidence. The attendant, introducing herself as Sarah Lee, suggested softly to Michael and Amanda that perhaps it would be easier if they moved to other available seats. After all, it would avoid any unpleasantness. Her tone carried no malice, but the expectation was clear. It would be best for everyone if they were the ones to bend. Amanda felt a sting at the words. She and Michael had paid for these seats, chosen them carefully, and looked forward to them for weeks. Yet within moments, it seemed, the responsibility to avoid conflict had been placed entirely on their shoulders. The message was subtle but sharp. Their comfort was negotiable. Someone else's convenience was not. As the conversation lingered, Captain Jonathan Martin received word of the dispute. His voice carried from the cockpit to Sarah, confirming that if moving the couple would resolve the matter, then perhaps that was the simplest course. Once again, the assumption hung in the air, unspoken yet heavy, that the ones standing in the aisle should make way. Michael felt heat rise in his chest, a mix of frustration and disbelief. Amanda touched his arm gently, sensing his tension. They had worked so hard for this, saved so carefully, and now stood humiliated before strangers. What was supposed to be the first joyful step of their vacation had turned into a test of dignity. The girl at the window barely noticed, content to gaze out at the wing of the plane, while her mother leaned back, certain that the matter would resolve itself in her favor. Throughout the cabin, people whispered. Some shook their heads as though the issue were trivial, something not worth a scene. Others watched with wide eyes, sensing that what was happening was more than a matter of seats. A quiet young woman a few rows behind lifted her phone, recording the encounter with a determined expression. She was Zoe Pack, a college student and aspiring journalist, who instinctively recognized that this small conflict was loaded with something far greater than the placement of passengers on a flight. For Michael and Amanda, the humiliation deepened as the seconds passed. The decision of whether to fight for their rightful seats or quietly submit carried with it the weight of something larger, something they both knew too well. It was not just about this flight. It was about being seen, about being recognized as having the same rights as anyone else in that cabin. And at that moment, as the murmurs of other passengers filled the silence left by the crew's hesitation, they both understood that their vacation was no longer beginning with joy, but with a test that would demand far more of them than they had expected when they left home that morning. The plane doors closed, the air conditioning hummed through the vents, and the confrontation, unresolved, hung suspended in the pressurized air of the first-class cabin. What had started as a simple boarding process was about to turn into something none of them could have imagined, something that would reach far beyond the narrow confines of that aisle. The air inside the first-class cabin felt heavier as the minutes dragged on. What had begun as a small confrontation now pressed against every corner of the aircraft, seeping into the posture of each passenger and the hesitant movements of the crew. Michael and Amanda remained standing in the aisle, tickets still in Michael's hand, as Caroline Hughes reclined comfortably in what were indisputably their seats. Her daughter Emily leaned against the window, earphones loosely hanging, oblivious or perhaps deliberately uninterested in the storm gathering around her. The moment should have been simple, a request to vacate seats that did not belong to her. Yet simplicity had evaporated the instant Caroline had insisted that her child's comfort outweighed anyone else's rights. Michael could feel the unease radiating from Amanda beside him. She did not speak, but her silence was eloquent, threaded with years of shared experience that told him exactly what she was thinking. They had both encountered countless moments when they were asked to yield, to be flexible, to absorb someone else's mistake or prejudice quietly so that things would not escalate. The tone of the flight attendant, Sarah Lee, had been polite, but the underlying assumption was one Michael had heard all his life. It would be easier if he gave in, easier for the crew, easier for the other passengers, easier for the captain, easier for everyone but him. Caroline's expression remained composed, but it was no longer merely about a seat. It was about entitlement, about the certainty that the inconvenience would never be hers to bear. She had shifted slightly in her chair, crossing her legs with the air of someone confident that she would not be moved. And then, in the way she glanced at Michael and Amanda, there was something sharper. It was not spoken aloud, but it was there, hovering between her polite words about her daughter's window seat. The suggestion that people like them did not usually occupy spaces like this. The first-class cabin had been, in her eyes, a world she owned. A world where Michael and Amanda's presence was an intrusion to be corrected by any excuse at hand. The murmurs around them had grown. Passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending to be uninterested, others subtly filming the encounter on their phones. Michael noticed one man 2 rows up, shaking his head and muttering under his breath about delays. A woman across the aisle bit her lip, as though torn between sympathy and discomfort. Everyone seemed to want resolution, but no one wanted to be the one to demand fairness. Amanda's hand brushed against Michael's arm, a gesture both steadying and anxious. He could feel the warmth of her touch and the tremor beneath it. He knew she was thinking about their vacation, about the fragile hope of rest they had carried onto this plane, and how easily it was being shattered before their eyes. Yet he also knew that she understood why he could not yield. To sit down elsewhere, to accept being displaced, would not only ruin their trip, it would reinforce the very patterns that had followed them all their lives. The flight attendant had returned after consulting the captain. Her smile had faltered and her tone had changed. It was less a suggestion now and more of a request framed as compromise. The captain believed it would be simplest if the Johnsons accepted alternative seating so that the flight could depart on time. The phrase hung in the air like a judgment. Simplest. Not fairest, not correct, but simplest. Michael looked at her and felt the weight of the decision pressing against him. The breaking point came not in a single phrase, but in the accumulation of all the unspoken things layered into the moment. The expectation of deference, the assumption of who should bend, the subtle but unmistakable dismissal of their dignity. Michael realized with startling clarity that to concede here would not be a small gesture of courtesy, but another entry in the ledger of compromises that had stolen piece after piece of his self-respect. His mind raced. He thought of the company he had built from nothing, Nova Systems, which now provided critical software for airlines across the continent. Reservation systems, flight management platforms, customer complaint tracking. His work touched nearly every part of the aviation industry. He was not merely a passenger. He was, in ways that Caroline, Sarah, or even Captain Martin could not imagine, one of the unseen architects of the very system enabling their flight. And yet, in this cabin, he was treated as a man out of place. The decision crystallized with a calmness that surprised even him. He would not yield, not this time, not in this way. His voice carried clearly, steady enough that everyone within earshot could hear. He demanded that the aircraft return to the terminal. The words rippled through the cabin like a shockwave. Passengers gasped. The flight attendant froze, and Caroline finally sat upright. Disbelief etched across her face. For a moment there was confusion, the kind that comes when order unravels in a space that depends on obedience. Sarah stammered, insisting that only the captain could make such a decision. Michael replied with quiet authority that he was not making a request, but an instruction. The cabin crew hesitated, then disappeared toward the cockpit, leaving a silence so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Amanda stood beside him, her heart pounding so hard she thought others might hear it. She looked at her husband and saw the steel in his eyes, the determination that came from years of being told to wait, to defer, to be patient. She knew then that their vacation had ceased to be a private escape. They were standing at the edge of something far larger. Around them, passengers buzzed with shock and curiosity. Some grumbled about the delay, frustrated by the disruption to their schedules. Others leaned forward, sensing history unfolding in the confined space. Zoe Pack, the student with her phone, continued recording, her camera steady now, her face set with conviction. She knew instinctively that this footage might matter far beyond the cabin. The engines, which had been idling as the aircraft prepared for departure, began to shift in tone. The plane turned back toward the terminal. Michael's decision had been carried to the cockpit, and to the astonishment of all, the order was being followed. The realization swept through the cabin in waves. A passenger had grounded a flight. As the aircraft rolled slowly along the taxiway, the atmosphere was unlike anything Amanda had ever felt. People whispered in urgent tones, disbelief etched into their expressions. Caroline's face had lost its confidence, replaced by a mask of anxious irritation. Her daughter still clung to the window seat, confused and restless. The crew moved briskly through the aisles, their politeness now strained by tension. Michael stood unmoving, calm on the surface but burning with a resolve he could no longer suppress. He thought of every time he had swallowed injustice, every time he had been expected to step aside to make things easier for someone else. Here, in the cabin of a plane bound for a sunny destination, he had decided enough was enough. The plane reached the gate, and the seatbelt signs chimed softly as though announcing not safety, but confrontation. The cabin fell into a hush, broken only by the hum of the engines. Every eye was on Michael, Amanda, and the woman who had refused to move. Everyone knew they were no longer watching a petty dispute over a window seat. They were witnesses to a moment that had already shifted into something larger, something that would not remain confined to this aircraft. The doors opened, and the first officials began to appear on the jet bridge. Reporters, alerted by whispers and text messages, had already gathered outside. Within the cabin, passengers gripped their phones, streaming, recording, documenting. What had started as a delay in departure had become an event that would spill into the headlines before the day was done. Michael looked down at Amanda and felt her hand slip into his once more. There was no retreat now. The line had been drawn, and they both knew it. The vacation they had imagined had been swept away, replaced by something unpredictable, perhaps even dangerous, but undeniably necessary. He had made his decision, and the world was about to watch its consequences unfold. The air that had once been thick with anticipation of a routine departure now carried the tremor of something far more consequential. As Michael and Amanda stood together in the cabin, the atmosphere around them shifted from quiet shock to something restless and electric. The aircraft had returned to the gate, the doors had opened, and through the narrow space of the jet bridge, shadows and voices spilled in. The cabin, once isolated and detached from the world, was now an extension of the terminal, exposed to the eyes of officials, airport staff, and the journalists who had somehow materialized in the short time since the order to return had been given. Michael felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but his resolve had not weakened. Amanda remained close by, her hand wrapped around his, her expression equal parts anxious and proud. They both knew there was no turning back now. Their decision to stand firm had shifted from a private refusal to give up seats into a spectacle that drew the attention of strangers across the world. Each breath they took seemed to be measured, heavy with consequence. As the first passengers began to deplane, murmuring in hushed tones about the extraordinary turn of events, Michael caught sight of a young woman walking backward down the aisle, phone held high, still recording. It was the same student he had noticed earlier, her determination steady, her voice occasionally breaking the silence as she narrated into her phone. Her name, he would later learn, was Zoe Pack, and in that moment she was no longer a passive observer, but a conduit between the confined space of the aircraft and the boundless reach of the digital world. The footage she had captured was already leaving the walls of the plane and flooding into the currents of social media. Michael could sense it before he saw it. The buzzing of phones, the hurried whispers among passengers, the almost palpable vibration of attention shifting outward, it all pointed to one reality. The world beyond the airport already knew. He overheard fragments of conversations, passengers showing each other screens where hashtags scrolled by in rapid succession. Rightful Seat was climbing across platforms, and within minutes it would dominate the feeds of millions. The airline's executives had gathered just beyond the gate, their faces tight, voices clipped and urgent. They spoke in low tones with one another, casting furtive glances toward the plane as if it had transformed from a vehicle of transit into a stage for crisis. Michael recognized the look of men and women who had spent years polishing their corporate images, now watching helplessly as one incident threatened to unravel it all. Amanda's eyes followed them too, and though she had always been the quieter of the two, Michael felt the silent echo of her thoughts. This was bigger than them now. It was no longer about 2 seats on a flight. It was about every silent compromise, every glance that dismissed, every decision made easier at their expense. When Michael stepped forward, the journalists surged. They called his name, some not even knowing who he was, but sensing his significance. Cameras pointed in his direction, flashes brightened the already harsh terminal lights, microphones hovered close to catch whatever words might pass his lips. The noise pressed against him, a chorus of questions tangled with urgency. He spoke not with anger, but with clarity. His voice rose above the crowd, steady and resonant, reaching not only the ears before him, but the countless others who would hear it through broadcasts and streams. He explained what had happened, carefully, plainly, without embellishment. A family had been denied the seats they had purchased because it was easier to pressure them into moving than to confront the entitlement of another passenger. The flight crew had supported that compromise, the captain had endorsed it, and the assumption beneath it all was that Michael and Amanda could be made to yield. The response from the crowd was immediate. Murmurs swept through, some outraged, others stunned. The journalists scribbled furiously or tapped frantically into their devices, broadcasting his words as quickly as they could. Amanda watched, heart pounding, realizing that the man she loved was not just recounting an incident, but framing it as something far greater. He spoke not only for them, but for every traveler who had ever been told they did not belong. The airline's representatives attempted to intervene. Rebecca Santos, the vice president of operations, stepped forward with a rehearsed calm, offering apologies and assurances of investigation. Her voice was measured, her words carefully chosen to diffuse rather than confront. But the crowd was not listening to her. Their cameras, their questions, their attention were fixed squarely on Michael. News alerts began to buzz on nearby phones. Major outlets were picking up the story, their headlines stark and direct. Black couple denied seats in first class. Tech CEO grounds, flight after discrimination incident. Airline faces crisis after viral video. The headlines varied, but the message was the same. This was no longer an isolated confrontation, but a moment of reckoning. Inside Michael's chest, his heartbeat matched the rhythm of history being written in real time. He could feel Amanda's hand tightening around his as though anchoring him in the storm. Zoe approached carefully, her phone still recording. She looked both exhilarated and overwhelmed, but she spoke with conviction as she updated her viewers. The numbers on her screen had soared. Hundreds of thousands were watching, and within the hour it would become millions. The stock market had already begun to react. News tickers reported Pinnacle Airways shares dropping in after-hours trading, while Nova Systems saw a sudden surge. Investors watching the same footage as the rest of the world recognized that Michael's defiance was not merely personal, but emblematic of leadership and accountability. The irony was bitter but undeniable. His refusal to surrender a seat was reshaping markets as much as it was reshaping conversations about justice. When the questions turned to what he intended to do next, Michael did not hesitate. He announced that the systems his company had built, the same ones used by most airlines, would now include mechanisms that tracked and escalated every complaint of discrimination. No longer would reports vanish into filing cabinets or be reduced to polite apologies that changed nothing. Each incident would reach executives directly, each pattern would be flagged, and each failure to act would leave an indelible record. The crowd around him went silent for a beat as the weight of his promise settled. Amanda felt a surge of pride swell within her. She had always known the strength Michael carried, but to see him wield it now, not in the boardroom, but in defense of their dignity, was something she had never fully imagined. She understood then that this would not stop with one flight or one airline. The storm had only just begun, and the ripples of their defiance would spread further than either of them had ever planned when they left home that morning. Rebecca Santos, still at Michael's side, tried to press again, her words clipped with urgency. She spoke of liability, of procedures, of the proper channels through which such matters were supposed to be addressed. But her words felt hollow, drowned out by the chorus of journalists and the digital tide swelling online. The world had already chosen its focus, and it was not her polished assurances. Michael's gaze swept across the terminal, over the faces of strangers who had become witnesses, over the journalists who would carry his words into millions of homes, and finally back to Amanda. He could see her exhaustion, her quiet fear, but also her unyielding faith. This was not the vacation they had planned. This was not the rest they had earned. But it was, somehow, the path laid before them, and he had stepped onto it without regret. As the cameras continued to capture every moment, as Zoe's stream surged toward 1 million live viewers, and as the first stories were published online within minutes of his speech, Michael knew there would be no going back. The world had seen, and now the world demanded change. He had not sought this stage, but it was his now, and he would use it not for comfort, but for transformation. The storm raged louder with every passing moment, the swirl of voices, lights, and digital echoes growing into something unstoppable. And standing there, hand in hand with Amanda, Michael felt the weight of history pressing down and lifting him up at the same time. Their seats had been taken, but their place had never been clearer. The storm that had broken open in the terminal that day did not subside with the closing of a few news cycles. It grew, fanned by the relentless tide of social media, by the endless conversations it sparked in living rooms, office break rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms. What had begun with 2 seats on a plane became something larger, something unavoidable. Within days, the footage of Michael and Amanda standing in the first-class cabin, steady in their refusal to yield, was replayed on every major network, dissected by commentators and framed as a watershed moment in the conversation about discrimination in travel. Hashtags did not fade. They multiplied. Stories poured in from people across the country, then across the world, who recognized in that confrontation echoes of their own experiences. Each testimony added weight to the truth that Michael had spoken. It was not about one seat, one passenger, or one airline. It was about a pattern, a system that had treated dignity as conditional. The airline at the center of the scandal had scrambled immediately, holding late-night meetings, issuing press releases, and commissioning consultants to advise on damage control. But no carefully crafted apology seemed to quiet the outrage. Every time an executive spoke of a misunderstanding, there were thousands of voices online pushing back, repeating Michael's words that the issue was not about miscommunication, but about a culture of assumptions that punished the people who least deserved it. The executives soon realized they could no longer offer promises of sensitivity training or policy reviews as if they were sufficient currency. The ground had shifted. They were no longer managing public relations. They were confronting a demand for transformation. In the months that followed, visible changes began to ripple across the airline industry. At first, the numbers were staggering. With Nova Systems' new software implemented across several major carriers, complaints of discrimination surged as passengers suddenly had a direct and unfiltered line to corporate oversight. What had once been buried or dismissed in customer service departments now flowed upward, marked with digital receipts that could not be erased. Over 800 complaints surfaced in the first month alone within Pinnacle Airways, echoing the very statistics Michael had cited. Other airlines faced similar reckonings. Industry leaders initially tried to dismiss the spike as exaggerated, the result of heightened publicity. But as patterns emerged and stories accumulated, denial was no longer possible. Employees who had once been trained to prioritize convenience over fairness found themselves living in a new reality. Cabin crews who ignored or mishandled complaints discovered that their actions were no longer invisible. Supervisors who brushed aside uncomfortable reports were confronted with escalations that reached not only their managers, but sometimes the press. At first, this new environment was fraught with fear. Every interaction felt like it might be scrutinized, every choice questioned. But gradually the fear gave way to adaptation. Staff began to adjust, not because of the threat of punishment, but because the culture around them shifted. Fairness was no longer an afterthought, it was the expectation. Michael and Amanda watched this transformation unfold from the sidelines of their ordinary lives, their names invoked in articles, documentaries, and public debates. They had not chosen this role, but it had chosen them, and everywhere they went, people seemed to recognize them. In airports, strangers approached to thank them. In hotels, employees whispered and then offered unexpected kindness. Their private life was never truly private again, but they held each other through the turbulence, knowing that what they had set in motion mattered far more than the discomfort it sometimes brought. Zoe Pack, the young student whose steady hand had captured the pivotal moments on her phone, saw her life change as well. Invitations came from networks, universities, and filmmakers. Her footage was credited not only with exposing one incident, but with igniting a movement. She embraced the role with energy, producing a documentary that stitched together the stories of ordinary travelers whose voices had long been ignored. Her film premiered to critical acclaim, a raw and necessary chronicle of the ways bias had shaped even the most routine journeys, and the ways technology could begin to dismantle it. Michael himself was thrust into a role larger than anything he had envisioned when he built Nova Systems. Once he had thought of his company as a tool for efficiency, for profit, for innovation in logistics. Now it was a tool for justice. Invitations to testify before Congress arrived. International organizations called to ask about adapting his systems for railways, buses, and ferries. Civil rights groups that had spent decades fighting for policy changes embraced his work as an unexpected ally. There were criticisms, too, voices that accused him of turning tragedy into branding, of wielding his influence in ways that unsettled traditional power. But through it all, the undeniable reality was that the industry had been forced to change, and that change had begun with him refusing to sit anywhere but where he belonged. As the months stretched into a year, the ripple effects deepened. Schools began piloting bias detection systems modeled after Nova's software, tracking disciplinary actions to ensure accountability. Hospitals explored similar frameworks for patient treatment. Housing authorities considered adaptations for tenant complaints. The model of transparency and escalation spread like a template, forcing institutions to confront biases they had long been able to conceal. For Michael and Amanda, life eventually returned to a rhythm, though never to what it had been. They finally allowed themselves the vacation they had postponed, boarding a flight once again in first class. This time, there were no obstacles, no sidelong glances, no questioning of their presence. The boarding process was smooth, the crew polite in ways that felt not performative, but genuine. And though Amanda carried a quiet tension until she sat in her seat, once settled, she felt a sense of release she had not known was possible. On that flight, the atmosphere was subtly but unmistakably different. In the cabin, signs displayed the airline's commitment to dignity and respect. The crew spoke not with scripted politeness, but with attentiveness that felt rooted in the awareness of accountability. Other passengers looked around, not with suspicion or entitlement, but with the calm of people reassured that fairness was the norm. Across the aisle, a young girl leaned toward her grandmother, pointing at one of the screens that displayed the airline's new creed. "Every passenger deserves dignity." The girl asked what it meant. Her grandmother smiled, her voice warm but edged with memory. She explained that there had been a time, not long ago, when people were not always treated fairly, when appearances could dictate respect, and when travelers were made to feel they did not belong. But things had changed, she said, because some refused to accept unfairness and used their voices to insist on better. Michael overheard the exchange, catching enough of the words to understand. He felt Amanda's hand slip into his once again, and when he looked at her, he saw in her eyes the same mixture of exhaustion and hope that had carried them through that day in the terminal. The vacation they had dreamed of was finally theirs, but more than that, the future had shifted in ways they had not imagined. The story of two seats on a plane had become a symbol of systemic change. Their names had been carried further than they ever wished, but in that recognition lay the truth. They had shown that dignity was not negotiable. The seats they had been denied had become the foundation of a movement that reached far beyond them. And as the aircraft lifted smoothly into the sky, carrying them at last toward rest, Michael knew that the revolution sparked in that cabin was still unfolding, carried now by others, by students, by workers, by leaders who saw in their story a mirror of their own. It was never just about them. It was about everyone who had ever been told to move, to wait, to yield. It was about the countless complaints buried in drawers, the stories dismissed as misunderstandings, the dignity deferred in the name of convenience. And now, because of one moment, one refusal, those stories were visible. Amanda closed her eyes, resting her head against the seat. Michael looked out the window at the expanse of sky stretching endlessly beyond, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the simple, profound peace of belonging exactly where he was meant to be. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories, and and stay tuned for the ones coming soon. And please share this video with your friends and family, because some stories are too important to keep to yourself.